devotion taken from Job chapter 36, verses 1 to 7. We have two thoughts. God's spokesman speaks, verse 1 to 4, and God is mighty and just in his dealing with people, verse 5 to 7. We shall continue the other thoughts in the subsequent verses in another devotion. Matthew Henry observed well. He says, Elihu, having largely reproved Job for some of his unadvised speeches, which Job had nothing to say in vindication of, here comes more generally to set him to rights in notions of God's dealing with him. Elihu sought to help Job to understand the reason for the afflictions that comes upon him so that he may grow spiritually. His other friends had stood that because he was a wicked man, therefore his afflictions were so great and so long. But Elihu, on the other hand, only maintained that the affliction was sent for his trial, and that therefore it was lengthened. And here is the key point, why Job was allowed to go through the length and breadth and the depth of his affliction. Here it says, because Job was not as yet thoroughly humbled under it, nor had duly accommodated himself to it. It is indeed true that when affliction comes to us, it sought to bring us, draw us to be closer to God, to submit to his holy will, and to subsist in the affliction, to find his peace and to understand the joy of his presence with us as our only sufficiency. This is a great lesson for the men of God to learn, established in the first book of the Bible, written, right? Even before the book of Genesis was written by Moses in the 1500 BC. Job existed before then, and we believe that this is the first book of the Bible. And Job was chosen for the theme in which we are dwelling now, his affliction, and how it was so prolonged, and how God is working in his heart to help him to understand the love of God for him in spite and despite of suffering and afflictions that comes in the Christian's life. Since God is almighty and is able to make all things well, why does he allow his people to go through such horrendous trials? If we look at Job's affliction, it is no small matter. When we look at the depths of his suffering, losing his health, losing his wealth, most of all, losing his loved ones, most unbearable. And yet, in this, Matthew Henry says, he urges many reasons taken from the wisdom and righteousness of God, his care of his people, and especially his greatness and almighty power, with which in this And in the following chapter, that's chapter 37, he persuades Job to submit to the hand of God. We are persuaded to submit, to subsist in the good will of God as he works out all things well amidst pain and suffering. Would the people of God be willing to trust him, be willing to conduct themselves in the light of God's providence? Here is the question that is brought before us. But before that, let us make a recap and a summary of Elihu's words so far. In the writing entitled Reflections on Sufferings from the Book of Job in Bible's Sacred Journal, October 97, it is written, Elihu began his discourses with lengthy introduction, an expression of anger toward both Job and his friends, righteous anger. He felt that both parties had been guilty of perverting divine justice and misrepresenting God. So Elihu attempted to correct the friends and also Job in his faulty image of God. Elihu affirmed that God was not silent during Job's sufferings. He argued that God is not unjust. Indeed, over the last few chapters, we saw that even in the pain that the believer experiences, God is speaking to us out of our pain, a message of his love, a message of his presence and his kindness, and he urges us to see it. Elihu sought that Job would understand that in his suffering, in allowing him to go through his suffering, God is not unjust. Neither is he uncaring, nor is he powerless to act on behalf of his people. Elihu presented a totally different perspective on suffering from that of the three friends. He said Job's suffering was not because of past sin, so it vindicated Job. Of course, Job himself has represented himself to maintain his ways before God and before men. Elihu shared and enlightened both the friends of Job and Job himself and others who were within listening years of his exhortation, that the suffering of Job was designed to keep him from continuing to accept a sinful premise for suffering. To keep him from accepting a sinful premise for suffering, that suffering does not always mean that a person has sinned against God, but to draw him closer to God, to teach him that God is sovereignly in control of the affairs of life, and to show him that God does reward the righteous, but only on the basis of his love and grace. And so Elihu said, you insist on justice and righteousness, but do you really want to be treated justly? Have you really considered what would happen if God took you at your word? Indeed, as we see how imperfect we are in our response to suffering, as we look at Job,